she said, wipe the spit off the face of Jesus from what these communists were saying. And he said, if I do that, you will no longer have a husband. And she said, I don't need a coward for a husband. I read the book, Tortured for Christ, and it really rocked my world. Richard was a Lutheran pastor, had a church in Romania. The Nazis came in first, and then the communists came in and basically took over all the church, tried to get the church all to join the Communist Party. Richard was a sole voice against that when they convened all the religious leaders. And actually, he didn't want to speak about the communists. He didn't want to speak bad about them. He just wanted to go on his way. But his wife Sabina's a powerhouse. She was only 4'11", but she was a powerhouse. And she said, at the meeting, she said, wipe the spit off the face of Jesus from what these communists were saying.
Wow.
And he said, if I do that, you will no longer have a husband. And she said, I don't need a coward for a husband. And so you can imagine that we actually reenacted all this in the movie Tortured for Christ. And he did. He spoke out against communism and said the church needed to serve Christ and Christ alone. So he was persecuted. He was imprisoned multiple times. He served a total of 14 years in prison. Sabina served 3 years in slave labor camp. They were eventually purchased out of Romania by a Finnish ministry, came to the U.S. and in 1967 wrote the first newsletter, which is The Voice of the Martyrs, which is the name of the organization. And it's distributed millions and millions and millions since. And he became a voice for today's persecuted church. It was such an amazing time because people would be, when he spoke in church, people would be blown away by this man. But he was the same man. Some people can show up in church and put on a different costume, maybe, in a different personality. But Richard and Sabina were the same through and through. Sabina was the most holy person I've ever met in my life.
Man, what a blessing. How do you think living with them, seeing how they had lived post-persecution, impacted your own walk and your own perception of the church?
Richard was very, very careful never to criticize the American church. And people would say things that would kind of set the stage. And he would say, America's invited me here. I'm a guest, and they've been very kind to me. And so I don't have the right to criticize. But it was very unique to me that, and I'm glad you asked this because it really leads to something deeper, if you'll allow me to share. I really found that the American church just wasn't aware, and they needed people like Richard to say something. And when I started at Voice of the Martyrs, and I would say, I'm going to work, Christian persecution, very few people were really aware of it. But what I found, and maybe some of this happened, obviously Richard planted the seeds, and then I joined Voice of the Martyrs, and I ran the marketing department and worked on the newsletter and consulting. As people became aware, they got involved. And now it's hard to find a Christian that doesn't know of Christian persecution. And so you had it under the communist. Then you had 9/11 happened, right? And all of a sudden we learn about Islam persecution. And then ISIS comes in and even puts on social media and martyrs Christians. And the world wakes up to Christian persecution. And I think God used people like Richard Wurmbrand, Brother Andrew, and others to bring the message to the church. But it took a while. And then other events happened. But I think if Richard were alive today and he visited churches, he would say, I think he'd be very pleased that the church has a lot of issues, but the church has woken up to persecution, and they really do care. And they help persecuted Christians. And it's from when I started over 30 years ago in 1990, completely different landscape. And now even denominations have targets to help persecuted Christians. So it happened, right? It was kind of a movement.
Right.
And it was accomplished. And I really feel good about that. And I wish, Richard's not here to experience it, but he probably, in my opinion, was the number one person responsible to start.
This episode of Rapid Response was brought to you by CTC Math. Visit them at ctcmath.com today.